Hello and welcome to another video guide on Kunoichi Succession post-rework. In today's video, we're going to be primarily discussing movement, how to move, and how to stay protected. Kuno's movement is very interesting compared to other classes. You have some of the fastest burst movement in the game, and you also have some of the farthest distances that you can travel within those bursts. The distance that you travel in such a short span of time will often contribute to a lot of winning in your engagements, because most people think that they're safe at a certain distance, generally for most classes, and Kuno basically lives right on the outside of what people normally view as a safe distance. So a lot of your skills and the primary way that you're going to be getting your CCs is getting around people's forward guard and either stiffen, stun, or oftentimes floating them from behind when they're trying to use a forward guard. And in order to create those opportunities, be able to move. So the general formula for Kuno movement is as follows. Pretty much iframe, movement skill, iframe, movement skill, iframe. Or you could do iframe, super armor, iframe, super armor, iframe. So the takeaway here is mostly start with an iframe and end with an iframe. That's the formula that I use for most of my movement, and the stationary super armor skills and movement skills are generally interchangeable depending on the situation. In a situation where you're not being pressured at all, but you still need to stay protected and want to use something other than your S-block forward guard because it's very weak, you can do more super armor rotations. And if you're getting pressured very heavily and don't want to take the SA trade damage, then you're going to prioritize using your movements. There's definitely some situational basis as to how much you want to move your character, and the overarching plot here that I want to get across is Kunoichi movement's pretty unique. It's the same thing with the combos. There's never really a one situation fits all answer for Kuno. You're constantly hindered by your long cooldowns and some of your skills and overall your lack of protections. So essentially in any given situation, you can assume that you're probably only going to have about 50%, maybe 60% of your kit available because every other skill is already on cooldown. So to take away from this, I would think of Kuno movement more in small parts and small chunks, rather than I'd think of it as, okay, you need to do these skills in order every single time to successfully move on Kuno. You need to be flexible with Kuno, and you need to be able to adapt in any given situation and react accordingly. Movement, similarly to combos, they're pretty interchangeable, is a lot of managing your cooldowns, and that's probably the hardest aspect of playing Kuno properly. The same can be said about a lot of classes, Succession classes in general, but Succession Kunoichi in specific definitely suffers from the combination of a constant situational awareness that you need on any class, but also the really tentative focus on your skill cooldowns. The skills that are going to be the most painful if you use them on cooldown would be Crescent Slash, Ankle Cutter, and Shadow Explosion. You can see that if you use Ankle Cutter, normally you go a fast distance and it's protected. If you use it on cooldown, you don't do anything and it's not protected. Similarly with Crescent Slash, you have a super armor and movement. If you use it on cooldown, you simply do that animation with no protection. And Shadow Explosion's animation is super armor when it's off of cooldown, and when it's on cooldown, the animation is the same, however, you do not have the protection. Generally, if you use these inputs when they're on cooldown, you're probably going to die. If you watch my play very closely, more often than not in large scale, usually when there's more than 5 people around me, you'll notice that from time to time, I'll use Ankle Cutter, Crescent Slash, or Shadow Explosion, or even Wheel of Wrath when one of them's on cooldown. This happens, and you can't play absolutely perfectly all the time, but we can definitely practice to minimize those occurrences. Just the skills in general that I like to use. Most of the time, I'm going to start with some combination of either Crescent Slash, Ankle Cutter, and Dance Macabre, the top skills on my tree here. And it would look something like that. The other skills that are definitely worth using in your movement every time they're off of cooldown would be Tendon Cutter, Flash Slash, smokescreen into concealment, art snatch, and shackle target. All those skills are going to be able to move you a reasonable distance and keep you reasonably protected. There's definitely a couple little gaps here and there, and you can definitely still get CC'd anywhere in this chain, but for the most part, rotating those skills, you're going to be able to move pretty freely, and you can also throw in some SA. You have Shadow Clone, which I use quite a lot as a super armor, and you also have Shadow Explosion, which are both good stationary SA skills. Before we move on too much further, I did want to touch on Tendon Cutter very briefly. There's a new key input for it with the Kunoichi reworks. Before, you had to turn your camera in order to move in a straight line. So it would look something like this. By angling your camera 90 degrees to the right, the first movement is a lateral left movement. So by angling your camera this direction, you will go the farthest distance straight. And that would look like this. And you can see how I more or less, it's a little bit sloppy, but more or less going in that straight line pattern. Now you don't have to do that. You can simply forward Q and you're going to get the full extent of the movement. Keep in mind that the float off of Tendon Cutter with the LMB input at the end of it, you need to be facing the opposite direction of your opponent if you want to CC them with it, or attempt to at least. So that would look something like this with forward Q input, and you simply turn it at the very end. Now, there's a couple interesting things you can also do here that I've noticed. If you use the forward Q input, but also turn your camera, you can position yourself in very interesting ways, like so. And put yourself to exactly where you want to be situated, and Tendon Cutter does do damage. It will hurt people now with post rework, so being able to move it in any direction and understanding how the skill works is very important as a Kuno, and you should definitely spend some time just playing around with all the different movement combinations of just that one skill. And the next skill I'd like to talk about is block jump and how to use block jump in your movement chain. You can use block jump as purely a movement skill to either teleport to either of the logs that it presents, or using your WW key input to immediately go forward with a fast iframe dash. The way that I like to use block jump more often than not is actually to stay in the animation cycle and use it to just evaluate what's happening around me, or so that I can tell whether or not I want to disengage, engage, or what kind of protected skills that I want to use going forward that are off cooldown. And sometimes I just use it to sit and block jump and just let my skills come off of cooldown. As you can see, pressing the key input will give you quite a substantial amount of time that you're in that iframe. So even though it seems like only a few seconds, it definitely can help you kind of get your bearing. You can spend a little bit of time looking around where other people are and kind of come up with a little plan in your head going forward as to what skills you want to use. It's a very flexible skill and it can go both ways on Kuno. It's both offensive and defensive, and that's simply how I choose to use it. Something I might do would be iframe, ankle cutter, iframe, crescent slash, iframe, dance, iframe, tendon cutter, iframe, smoke, into concealment, and then sinew cut backwards, and then you can repeat the movement chain from there as the skills start to come off of cooldown. A lot of it is figuring out whether you want to move or stay still, and plugging in the skills that are going to help you in that situation, as I mentioned earlier, as opposed to whether you want to use a stationary super armor to SA trade with people, or you're already weak and you don't want to take any damage. The movement itself really isn't that hard of a concept. It's more about how you apply it. So realistically, you just need to practice if you're, having a hard time. If you're struggling with the key inputs, if you feel like you're going to go brain dead halfway through and need time to reassess, that just means that you don't have enough experience in the class. I've been playing the class since Succession came out, and it definitely takes a long time to be able to close your eyes and go on autopilot and just let your skill tree take over. But you also really don't want to be on autopilot, especially in 1v1s when people can pay a little bit more attention to what you're doing. Being unpredictable is going to be your best friend, even outside of 1v1 situations. And keeping your movement unpredictable, changing up what skills you use in which order, and deciding whether or not you want to use that super armor or that movement skill is definitely going to increase the probability of you surviving and getting kills. I would like to touch briefly on my use of Shadow Stomp on my movement combo. It's the only fully unprotected skill that I use in my movement chain, and honestly, you just kind of have to send it. It does so much damage, it's a float. If you hit somebody with it, you're going to hurt them really bad, and it's just kind of worth the risk to use. But if you want to play, in my opinion, strictly correctly, you really shouldn't use Shadow Stomp outside of combo fodder, but that's the playstyle choice that you're going to have to make for yourself. I'll also go into invisibility as movement. This is an interesting concept as stealth is an extremely powerful mechanic and you should abuse it in every situation you can. Keep in mind there are a couple things that are basically situations where you should never go stealth, and whenever you're fighting against range classes, because some of their skills will just immediately take you out of stealth. This can be very bad if you try to use stealth in this situation, because they're just going to be randomly casting skills and it's just going to accidentally hit you in stealth, give you your position away, and probably get you killed in the meantime if you get CC'd. So long as there's the absence of most of those classes, we're talking Archer, Ranger, Witch, Wizard, Awakening Corsair, Awakening DK, anything with a lot of range damage or CC potential, or you have something to hide behind like a wall or a tree, you can definitely stealth as movement, because you can be doing your movement chain and then pop into stealth around a corner really quickly, or whatever cover that you have, and then just wait for whatever opportunity you're looking for. So now I'm gonna play some clips of me in some scaled PvP, because I think that movement should be fairly obvious, and I'll touch more on how to play in big fights in a separate video, but for now I want to give you some food for thought and some ideas and some ways that you can apply the movement chains that I told you about, and how to react according to the situation, which is going to be more crucial to keeping you alive more often than playing the class strictly correctly. You really have to be a rat. Nobody should be surprised by that, and sometimes you got to be a little bit 2000 IQ. Also throw in a little disclaimer here that keep in mind the way that I play definitely factors my gear into the equation, so you might not be able to replicate my exact play style, which is a little bit greedier than some other people, and you'll see me go back and re-engage the fights where my health is still pretty low, so that's not a habit you should develop until you get to that point in gear progression. Lastly, touching on that a little bit further, having people chase you on Suck Kuno is incredibly powerful, because you can turn the tables on them very quickly. If people are chasing you from behind and you're doing your movement chain, you can immediately flash slash backwards and try to CC them. You can tendon cutter backwards and try to CC them. You can sinew cut, set up a smoke screen. There's a million things that you can do when you're being chased very aggressively, because a lot of times people don't expect you to just turn around on them like that. I really appreciate the support. Guys, do whatever you can, and maybe post some of these videos in your discords or whatever else ideas you come up with. Come hang out with me live on Twitch, and if you have any questions, or you're just struggling with some part of what I've showed you here or in any of the videos, I'd be happy to answer any of the questions you have. So with that, I'll see you guys in the next one.